Welcome in, folks. We are just getting settled here. We're going to give it another minute or so before we get started. So please take this moment to do whatever you need to do to feel present today, whether that's grabbing a cup of coffee, taking a stretch, disabling your notifications, like myself, throwing your cat over the side of the chair, whatever you need to do to fully be here. That's what we ask, and then we'll get started.
And FYI, Janine and Louise are on our DEI task force. So they're members of our task force.
And I apologize, I'll have to log off early and I'll be eating lunch during this at some point too. So I'll stay on as long as I can.
It's good to see you, Dr. McMillan.
Good to see you, Mayor Burns, and everyone here.
All right, thanks everybody. So we're going to get started. You'll notice that the session is being recorded. So if folks would like to access it afterwards, they'll have that available. Before we start with our introduction into inclusive language and our session agreements, I want to hand it over to Mayor Burns to announce today's session.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. Happy Thursday. It's a delight to be with all of you, and I am particularly proud to welcome all our DEI task force members and, of course, our facilitators. And I just want to be very clear on something, that I am proud of all the work that's been done to date. I am looking forward to more work being accomplished. And as I've shared with many folks on the task force and elsewhere, I know this opportunity is both refreshing, and I know that the work is both challenging yet rewarding. So I stand with you every step of the way. I thank you for allowing me to hang out with you today, and I'm looking forward to learning more. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so again, thank you all for being here. To start us off, we'll go over our learning objectives. Today, we'll talk about key DEIB terms and what they mean so that we all are on the same page. We will learn some guides for inclusive language. We have 5 principles for you to follow. We will also understand what trust is and how to build and repair it if necessary. And so that's our day. We like to say hi, so I'll let Alida start, and then Ivana, you can go, and then I'll come back to me.
I know some of the folks on this call and some of you are new to me. It's a wonderful day to be together. I'm Alida Miranda Wolf. I'm the CEO of Ethos, which of course is your diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging partner. We are very proud to be partnered with a community that is focused on putting inclusion first and considering the needs of everyone within the community as they hope to find deeper belonging within your whole environment. I identify as a white passing Latina cisgender woman with invisible and visible disabilities. I am neurodivergent. I'm a new parent. I am a second generation immigrant, and English is my second language. I am also proud to be a member of my Evanston community, but also entrenched in Illinois across the state. Being able to invest in the community I'm part of is very important to me. So that's a little bit about me. The last thing I'll say is I wrote a book called Cultures of Belonging, Building Inclusive Organizations That Last. I'm currently on deadline for my second book, which is the first-time manager, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the reason that I name that is if there are any resources or tools that we don't go over today, chances are I have some for you. So please do not hesitate. I have had to do years of research to write these books, which means I have so many articles, books, models, frameworks, and I would love to share them with you. With that, I'm going to hand it over to our technical facilitator today, Ivana.
Hello, everybody. I've met, I think, a lot of you before, but for those of you that don't know me, my name is Ivana Slavak-Grubisic, and I use the pronoun she, her. I'm the technical facilitator today, as Alida mentioned, and what that means is if you have any questions, anything arises throughout the session today, you can feel free to message me over Zoom. I'll be happy to help you. I'm also the chief of staff here at Ethos and get to work closely with Alida and our entire team on sort of how are we helping bring belonging, bring inclusion into our communities and the world around us. So I'm really happy to be here. I've had the privilege to be able to work with Mira, Janine, Lise, Ashley, and the entire DEI task force in bringing this, not just this session together, but bringing this initiative around creating an assessment of the city of Geneva and then working towards making recommendations in that, and that will come later this year. So just really happy to be here. Again, if I can assist you in any way, feel free to message me, and I will bring it back to Karen.
Thanks, Ivana. Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Thomas. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a Black, biracial, cisgendered woman. I'm a mother and I'm an educator. I taught for 13 years in Chicago public schools. I also continue to do work in schools. I lead the Black Student Union at the high school in my area. And I also work with the League of Women Voters, which crosses into the high school, but also crosses into our community as well, and our village boards. So we've done a lot of work there. Educating and speaking and supporting folks that need to be seen and heard in the community. So that is why I'm really excited to be here. I know a handful of you already because I also have worked with some of you on in the DEI task force. So excited to see you again and really excited for today. All right, before we get into our content, we like to just go over Zoom best practices really quickly. So Alida mentioned we are recording. That is so you can have this recording after. And then you'll also see that it says that we're live recording. We are not live recording and streaming anywhere. What that is our closed captioning service, which is available for you to use. So if you would like that service, you can go into the bottom of your bar. It will say CC, you can click it. And or you can go to the top of the screen as well and go to the carrots and the arrow and go down and it'll bring it into a whole nother screen for you. All right. We have a question for you. We would like to know what is the one question or questions that you would like answered by the end of today's session. So again, we're here to talk about DEIB key terms, what trust looks like, and how to have inclusive language and use inclusive language. What is one thing you'd like to take away from today's session? And when you have that thought, go ahead and put it into the chat.
And as you're thinking about your questions, some of the questions that we get asked most frequently when we lead this session are, one, how do I self-identify? Do I have to self-identify? We also get asked about specific areas of inclusive language, specifically, how does inclusive language tie into our wayfinding and our signage? How does inclusive language incorporate into community events or programs? So if you're struggling to come up with a question, no, everything is on the table. We really just want to be of service. And I see that Debbie and Diane have already included some questions in the chat. So thank you.
We have another minute to get your questions in the chat. And like Ivana said, you can put them in the chat at any time. All of us are watching the chat and we'll answer them as they come up. Yep, Miriam, that's a good one. All right, based on what's coming up in the chat, I feel like we'll answer those throughout the session. And again, if anything else comes up during, go ahead and just put them in there and we will address it as we go. All right, we have one more ask from you. When you hear the word belonging, what does it mean to you? It can be a feeling that comes up when you hear the word belonging. It can be an experience that you had. It could be an example. What does it mean to you? Kevin, Mr. Mayor Burns, thanks for your question.
Oh no, Kevin sounds good, please. Thank you. Only my grandkids call me mayor, so it's good.
Debbie, belonging means acceptance. Thank you. Feeling at home with yourself and in the presence of others. That's very beautifully put. And we'll give it 30 more seconds for either to put a question or answer this. What does belonging mean to you? Respect, I see. Included, welcomed, and valued. Comfortable in your community and with those that you interact with. Thank you. So our next slide, we will give a definition for belonging. We have some other definitions that we like to go through first though. And so this is a pyramid that we use, and it is set up in a pyramid for a reason, because at the foundation of the pyramid, we have diversity. And we are looking at this pyramid as it builds up, and you do need this foundation first to move up. And you can see that belonging is at the top. And so if we go back down to the foundation, which is diversity, this is just how much variety there is in a given situation or a given group of folks. And so if you have less diversity, belonging is a lot easier to achieve. Whereas if you have a more diverse setting, it's harder to achieve. And I also like to say here, noticing too, and you'll see in the next few slides when Alida and I go over our identities, that even if we automatically think that there's a lot or less diversity, people are bringing a lot to the table with them through their experiences and how they choose to identify. So that's the diversity piece. The next level is equity. And so I like to move back from equity to go to equality first. And that's usually the term that we hear, that everyone has equal access, right? Everyone's given the same thing, which is really important. That's the baseline. Once everyone has access to the same things, right? Laws affect everyone. People, there's a library that everyone can attend and use those privileges. That's equality. The next step is equity. And that's when a community, an organization, they really start to look at what are the individual needs of people in our community or in our organization, right? So yeah, everyone has access to our library, but can everyone actually get into the library? Do we have ramps for people to use who need that? Are our doors wide enough? What types of books are we providing for folks? What other type of programs are we giving? And that's really dependent on who is in your community and what needs they need to be able to thrive within your community. The next level is inclusion. And this is so once we start meeting people's needs, they can start to feel this sense of inclusion and a sense that that they're being valued, right? And that they're being seen and that they're actually a part of the group. And so some folks, it's important to understand here that you can feel included. If you work at the library, you can feel included on your staff, but maybe you don't feel included once you leave the library in the larger community, right? So there are different contexts in where you can feel included in. And as a village, we want to make sure that folks are feeling included as a whole in our community, whether they go into a certain restaurant, a certain store, at a park, right, in different neighborhoods. The next level is cultural awareness, and this is a skill. And so this training is a really good example of giving this skill to folks to practice, right? How to have inclusive language, that's a skill. And we need it to be able to communicate to people who are different than us, identify differently, and have different experiences. And so if we think about that, you're like, everyone I come into contact probably has different experiences than I do. And so learning ways to interact and to listen and to solve conflict is really important. And that's what's at this level. So it's a skill, it can be practiced, which means we can improve it, and we will spend most of our time improving. And then we finally get to the top, which is belonging. And belonging, our definition of belonging is a sense that you are a part of something greater than yourself, that you value and respect, that values and respects you back. So it's basically a relationship, right? You have a relationship, in this case, with your community where you feel valued, seen, and heard, and that you need that and they need you as well, right? So it's this act of being in relation together. And if you think about it in that way, you actually need everything underneath of that to do it. You need diversity, you need to have needs met, you need people to feel included, and you need to be able to communicate across differences.
So this brings us into understanding identities, which is the key to understanding inclusive language. If we are not in tune with identity, then it feels like we have a bunch of arbitrary rules around language where we are constantly trying to catch up and learn because maybe we'll say the wrong thing and what will happen as a result. So when we understand identity, first things first, we understand the importance of inclusive language. Also, we have the data we need to make decisions about how we use language that are aligned with principles as opposed to rote memorization. So when we think about our identities, I think it's worth pulling apart the fact that there are many types of identities we hold. So you have your individual identity, your social identity, and your cultural identity. Your individual identity is how you see yourself. So this is your preferences, your likes and dislikes, what you consider to be your strengths, your accomplishments, your personality traits. That is how you see yourself. Social identity is how others see you. And that may be something that you also see in yourself, which is why these circles are overlapping. There aren't clear cuts between them. So the fact of the matter is other people look at me and they see a cisgender woman. That's my social identity. And my individual identity has an acceptance and understanding, awareness, even a pride in that identity. Cultural identity is who you are because of where you grew up. So the language that you speak, the food that you eat, the music that you listen to, even things like what you consider to be right and wrong are going to be informed by the culture that you grew up in. When I say that these are interconnected, I really mean it. And how it shows up is, let's say in individual identity, I share that I'm an extrovert. Well, what do you make of the fact that according to Susan Cain's research, the United States is the most extroverted country in the world and China is the most introverted? Is it possible that some of my personality is informed by the American culture I'm part of? Similarly, my cultural identity may inform how others see me in my social identity and how that translates into individual identity, because your social identity is context dependent. So if I am in my hometown in South Florida where everybody speaks Spanish, and I speak Spanish too, the fact that Spanish is my first language and English is my second language takes on a whole other meaning than when I'm in my community in Evanston, where most of the people are speaking English as their first language and know me as someone who is an English speaker. We can break that down even further by looking at how identity plays out. So I made this diagram of myself to show you, one, which of these types of identities are most important to me. So you can see my individual identity and my cultural identity are specifically the most important types of identities, followed by social identity. If I had made this diagram 5 years ago, my social identity bubble would have been a lot bigger than the other two. In my individual identity, you can see that there are a few core elements of who I am. So I identify as a rabbit person. I have a bunny room in my home. I like to rescue rabbits. I am a proud rabbit caretaker. As I mentioned, I'm an extroverted person, and I wear the fact that I have been called somebody who dresses like a goth Carmen Sandiego as a badge of honor. So that's part of my individual identity, but there's some overlap here. So the fact of the matter is, some of my social identity is why I'm a rabbit person, for example. My experiences as someone with a mobility disability, with several chronic illnesses, with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, mean that I have an impulse to care for animals, creatures, people who have experienced harm. And then my cultural identity, the sort of big three that are actually often associated with Latina people in the US, are my actual country that my family comes from, that my family is still in. So I'm Cuban. My religious identity, I'm Catholic, and my relationship to my family, I'm a mother. So this is me. Your diagram is going to be really different, but this is what I want people to see when they see me. And this is why language is so important, because if these are things that are not acknowledged, that are not seen, that are not respected, then I won't feel a sense of belonging in my community. And you can see Karen's example too.
So mine looks different, very different. My social identity circle is much larger, as I feel like that dictates a lot in how I am seen and move and the experiences that I've had in this world, which mainly is being biracial and being a Black woman, I think is huge. And in being in education, I am neurodivergent, I'm dyslexic. And so that is determined how I have moved a lot, which has affected my individual identity. I do have some in my individual identity that are not social, which I'm a runner and a gardener, right? So those are things that you would have to get to know me to see and understand. And my culture identity is always a really hard one for me. I am American. I was also transracially adopted, which means I was adopted. I personally am adopted by white parents, so parents of a different race. And so cultural identity has always been hard for me in how that fits in. So it's not really as large as the others and kind of a little bit separate from the others as well. All right, so with that, you can see why it is so important to learn how to use inclusive language, because folks are coming with all of these identities into our spaces. And like Alida said, in order to feel like I belong, I need to feel like I'm valued and respected within those identities. So we have 5 principles. And the first principle is to use people first language. So remembering that folks are more than their descriptors, right? We are human. And so saying things like person with a disability or a woman on the engineering team is more inclusive, because you are seeing that person first and then you are using descriptors after. Our second principle, go ahead.
I'll just add here. So when you get to know people, you will understand if they want you to use people first or person first language or identity first language. So I am a disabled person and I am comfortable with identity first language. So you can refer to me as a disabled person. The main key is something that Mira said stuck out to me in the chat, which is things are changing so quickly and it's hard to keep up on this. Person first language is the most universally accepted. So putting your person before their characteristics, if you're not sure, is a default that is going to be your most inclusive default. And then you can always make an adjustment if they identify specifically how they want to be called.
Well, and this goes back, Alida, to you saying these aren't a set of like strict rules to memorize and follow. there is fluidity in it, and there is room to ask, right? And to be in relationship with folks. And I think that's the point. And you'll see that theme through here is basically self-identification is the best. But in order to do that, you need to start building a relationship. So until you know, that's the best. So the second one is universal phrases. So we want to avoid language that folks may not understand based on their experiences, how they were raised, what industry they're in or what business they're in, right? Acronyms. We want to make sure we're making what we say as accessible as possible. So instead of saying like we're going to twist their arm, we're just going to convince them. Team huddle, we are having a team meeting. And so the way that I do this is I always think, let me say what I mean. So as soon as I say something that's not actually what I mean, I try to correct it. And especially being in classrooms with students, third graders at the time, it's really important that I am literally saying what I mean. And so that helps me kind of stay in line with principle number 2. Principle 3 is self-identification, which is what we were talking about. So yes, these are guidelines to use, but always allow the opportunity for folks to self-identify. And so that can happen also before you have a relationship. So if we think about Zoom, we put our name and we put our pronouns, right? By us putting our pronouns is allowing folks it's okay to self-identify how you would like here, right? Or asking people, can you please put your full name and your pronouns on your Zoom name, right? You're allowing that space. We also do very full introductions, as you can see. And so again, inviting folks to see that and be comfortable. Alida, did you want to jump in?
I saw a note from Pete about how huddle is illustrating. So this is coming back to the space of disability and the fact that many people with mobility disabilities couldn't participate in a physical huddle. So it's considered ableist language, but more than that, what I would say is if you're speaking to people who are speaking English as a second, third, or fourth language, huddle doesn't translate into other languages as clearly as other terms. This is something that I've had to really learn myself because I use a lot of idioms and a lot of phrases or slang. And we do quite a bit of work with people in communities who, again, may not have English as their first language. And so they just don't understand what we're saying. I also want to add a point about pronouns because I saw in the chat earlier, how do we get people to come on board with us around inclusive language without feeling defensive? One thing that we see very commonly in communities is this resistance to, well, I don't want to share my pronouns. Don't make it mandatory. It's more about saying, if I share my pronouns, respect them, not you have to do anything related to your own. This is the key to self-identification. It should not be mandatory, but it should be respected when others disclose. Just like if I tell you, pronounce my name Alida, if somebody else keeps calling me Alida or Lydia, it wouldn't be rude or inappropriate to correct them and say, no, my name is Alida. The same thing is going to be true around self-identification.
All right, principle 4, no normal. So not making your own group with what you identify with the normal. So for example, normal parking, instead you just say, again, say what you mean, non-accessible parking. Non-white, you would say person of color instead. And principle 5 is cultural awareness. This happens a lot in like at work. We use a lot of, actually in the classroom too. We use a lot of cultural language out of context. And a lot of that language is often sacred language or based around religion. So an example, so again, saying what you mean. So instead of saying tribe, saying community, guru, you would just say expert. Just because, especially here, we have a lot of different cultures here. And in the nature of how we use language, I think we have taken some of these language because it is more interesting to say rather than just expert. But again, making sure we say what we mean in hopes to make people feel seen and heard and not excluded.
With something like Sherpa, what I like to emphasize is a Sherpa isn't actually a porter or guide. So you're not even saying what you mean. The Sherpa refers to the 8 different Nepalese clans that part of the clan's history and legacy is serving as guides to people climbing the very famous mountain in Nepal. But that's not what a Sherpa is. It's actually like using somebody's family crest, which you wouldn't do if you were talking about what someone is trying to do. So the simple way to think about this is, how do I talk in such a way that everybody can understand what I'm saying? So how do we respond in real time when these situations occur? What we want to talk about here is when we're in, let's say, a community environment, we want to, as much as possible, avoid labeling other people and see how they share their own labels, if at all. So there are terms that are used interchangeably that aren't interchangeable. Being Black versus African American versus Black American, which are all different racial signifiers, they mean different things. So there are many Black people who don't identify as African American because they are coming from the Caribbean, their family is coming directly from continental Africa or from somewhere else. African American is really tied to people who have been in the US. Similarly, there are many African American people who don't want to be identified as Black or Black American. So as much as possible, letting other people name themselves versus assuming on their behalf is key, but also you can always quickly apologize and course correct if you get it wrong. So there are a lot of people talking about this question of, are they Hispanic? Are they Latino? Are they Latinx? Are they Latina? You are Hispanic if you are coming from a Spanish-speaking country. You are Latina if you are coming from Latin America. So you can be Hispanic and from Spain, but you can't be Hispanic and from Brazil, which is a Portuguese-speaking country. You can't be Latina or Latino or Latinx if you're coming from Spain. The other thing that's important here is whenever we're using a term like Latinx or Latina, we are specifically talking about people in the United States. That's often missed. So if I am not in the US, I am whatever country I'm from. I'm Peruvian or Ecuadorian or Brazilian. But this is all about the identifiers. There are often questions about, well, I was using Latinx and now I was told that that was wrong. Why is that wrong? One, you can ask, that's not off limits. Two, in case you're wondering, the term Latina is just much easier to pronounce in Spanish and was originated by Spanish speakers and Portuguese speakers. That E is the gender neutral in those languages, as opposed to in English, X is. So by trying to be gender inclusive and creating the term Latinx, which is a very academic term, it came out of a university higher education setting. We actually created a barrier, and this is the main lesson for us. If the term didn't come from the people who identify with the term, it's more likely to miss something important, which is, again, why we want to make sure we give people the space to name themselves. So how do you respond in real time when situations occur so that folks don't become defensive and are still willing to learn and listen? So we wanted to give 3 examples that are very common for us inside of communities. The first is around pronouns. So one, I want to note that there are just people who don't understand why using improper pronouns is insensitive. So being able to explain that can be enough for some people. So why is not using the pronouns someone has identified with insensitive? Because it shows a lack of willingness to respect people and prioritizes language terms over inclusive terms. I want to note that my best friend is a linguist and an academic background in linguistics has informed this approach. When somebody says it's not grammatical or that's not the grammar rule, it's worth noting that grammar rules change pretty much every decade. So even that can be an arbitrary rule. And I like to talk to folks about pronouns the way I do about name pronunciation. You wouldn't continuously mispronounce somebody's name because it shows a lack of respect for who they are. The same thing is true with pronouns. So what do you say when you're in these situations or you're offering guidance to someone? If you notice that another person has misgendered someone in your community, you can interrupt without creating conflict by asking, how do you identify? Or how would you like me to refer to you? Or what pronouns should I use? This is a better response because you are using appropriately gendered terminology and you also set the example or model for others. When we look at change, what makes people change their behavior is actually social pressure more than anything else. It's not a rule or a law or a policy. It's whether other people around you are doing it consistently. So it's about getting your reps in. That's one of the most non-confrontational and inclusive ways of correcting exclusive behavior. We can look at an example like race in a similar way. So why is assuming somebody's racial identity insensitive? For one, it undermines how they experience themselves. So depending on who I am, you may see me in a certain way, and that might not be my racial identity, or the assumption that you make could be dangerous to me and put me in a state of risk. So again, just like with pronouns, this is a time to ask how you identify or how you would like to be referred to. And being able to actively listen to, validate, support individuals, that is key to making people feel empowered. And something that I have to stress here, I've interviewed a lot of people who are coming from historically resilient groups about what is important to them. And they often say, I don't actually need people to understand. I just need them to believe me. So when I say this is who I am, that it isn't called into question or challenged based on their assumptions. How I think about myself, how I talk about myself should be respected in this relationship. And then the last one here around ethnicity, using ethnicity interchangeably is very common. So we might say that we are interchangeably using the terms Latinx or Hispanic, but we do this with other communities that are made up of a diaspora or many different cultures. The term Asian American is relatively new, for example. It only emerged in the 1960s, and it encompasses East Asians, Southeast Asians, South Asians. It includes some Polynesians and Pacific Islanders, depending on how it's being used. And while there are things that they have in common, specifically building a coalition together, to be East Asian and South Asian, let's say Chinese and Indian, absolutely not the same thing. So again, when we're explaining to people why we want to make a change or a difference, we want to be able to say fact check. We want to be factual. We want to say the right thing in terms of it being accurate and correct and being able to characterize a person. This also helps us reduce microaggressions that can take an emotional toll. So microaggressions are these daily reminders that you don't belong here. And so when we honor somebody's identity, we ask them to self-identify, or we create the space for them to self-identify. We avoid making comments or generalizing who they are based on their ethnicity or ethnic experience. So what do you do when you make a mistake? I saw this from Mayor Burns. How are we limited by our fear of failure? What do we do in response? When you make a mistake, correct yourself and move on. It should be so quick, so fast. So if you use the wrong pronouns, you can say, I'm sorry about that. They didn't X, Y, and Z. When someone corrects you, thank them and move on. It doesn't have to be a long conversation. It doesn't have to be a long apology. You don't have to explain yourself. Thank you. I'll remember that and continue the conversation. When you're in mixed groups of people, get used to just quickly cutting into the conversation with a correction when they get something wrong, like pronouns. You also want to make sure that you don't make people feel like a burden because you're struggling with their identities. This is a you problem, not a them problem, so to speak. If I struggle to pronounce somebody's name, I shouldn't be saying, well, why do you have such a difficult to pronounce name? I should be asking myself, how can I pronounce this name correctly next time? And make sure that you are in a space where you can practice, whether it's with yourself or someone else that you trust, so that you can get it right. This all brings us to a discussion of how we build trust. This is the core piece of inclusive language. Again, at Ethos, we have a 35-page document of all of the terms we use, all of the terms we avoid using, and why, what the research is, how we support it. Ultimately, though, a lot of that isn't necessary if you're in relationships with people you trust. A lot of the debate around language and whether we're using the right language or not is coming from a place of mistrust. If I made a mistake with someone I had deep trust with, the repair for that would be really easy. It's that doesn't exist already. So if we understand what trust is, that can also help us. I like to use Rachel Botsman's definition of trust. She is a trust researcher who actually predicted Airbnb and then became one of their early investors. Good for her. She defines trust as a confident relationship with the unknown. So in her model, we have everything we know on one side and everything we don't on another side. Trust is not knowing everything. Trust is being able to navigate uncertainty and still feel like your interests will be kept at heart. So when we don't have trust, we need transparency, because transparency makes people feel safe in that all of the factors or information is known. Whereas trust means that we believe that we are going to be stronger together, that we can rely on one another, that we can care for each other. It's important to know that these are not the same thing. And often transparency is a necessary precursor for trust. I like to describe it like this. So I am in a long-term relationship. I've been with my husband for 12 years. And his best man at our wedding has also been in a marriage for 12 years. And they will say we have a really trusting marriage because we share email passwords and we read each other's text messages. Now, to me, that's a very transparent relationship. Everything is known. But that's not necessarily a trusting relationship. In my case, I often go back to the fact that I was giving a keynote speech in Boston. It was the biggest speech I had ever given. It was 20,000 people. And my husband sent me a text message from the airport because he had been invited to a town hall that was being broadcast on CNN. He's in the climate change space. And he was just going to fly to New York and go and do it. And I didn't have any context. I didn't have any details. He was basically like, I talked to your mom. We have a pet sitter. I made sure the house was all in order and I'm going to go do this town hall thing. Talk later. The fact that I was totally okay with that, just like he was totally okay with the fact that I'm at this keynote and we don't really know what the other one is doing, would actually mean we have a trusting relationship. I don't believe he's going to do something that would put me or our relationship or our family life at risk. I have a confident relationship with the unknown. So that's the difference. There are things that make people trustworthy. And if there's anything you take away from today's session, I hope it's this slide. This is how you become trustworthy. It's in how you do things and why you do things. How you do things really breaks down to two questions. Are you competent and are you reliable? Competent means that you do the things that you say you're going to do and they're done well. Reliable means that you are consistent. So you can be very competent, but not reliable. And that is going to impact trust. So Let's say that I am very competent at using inclusive language, but I'm not reliable in showing up with it in the moment. I wouldn't be so trustworthy in that situation. I can be reliable and incompetent. So maybe I show up at every task force meeting and try my best, but I'm still not processing the practices that we need to be putting in place. That's going to impact how trustworthy I am. So being able to cultivate a sense of competence on issues like inclusion, equity, and belonging, and being reliable, being consistent. I like to quote The Good Place a lot on this. It's one of my favorite shows, but Chidi on The Good Place will say when teaching ethics, principles aren't principles if you pick and choose when to use them. That's the key to reliability. You stick to the principle, you always stick to the principle. Why you do things, your intention, actually does matter quite a bit. And this comes down to, do you act with integrity and do you act with empathy? So if I do things because I have a strong set of principles, but I'm not empathetic about those principles, or I don't show understanding or support for others, they may find me intellectually trustworthy, but not emotionally trustworthy, which is not going to give them a consistently strong sense of trust with me. On the flip side, I can come from a place of empathy, but because of my empathy, because of my sense that I really want to show compassion and care and understanding for others, I may violate my own principles or agreed upon principles, and that might impact how trustworthy I am. So if we want to establish that we're trustworthy with people, we must be competent, reliable, act with integrity, and act with empathy. Now, with all of that said, it's worth noting that because we're human and human relationships are tricky and we make mistakes, there are going to be times when we breach trust. That is normal, it's natural, it's going to happen. The good news for you is the trust research shows us that actually when you breach trust but engage in good repair, you can actually strengthen a sense of trust, because now it's known what happens when trust is breached, and the answer is positive, right? So what do you do if there's a trust breach? Let's say I do use the wrong pronouns, or I do use a term that's racially insensitive or ableist or sexist. Maybe I didn't know. What do I do in that situation? The 5 core elements are responsiveness. So I must respond immediately. If I say nothing, the trust breach will remain open and usually worsen. So first I have to acknowledge the thing happened. Then I have to acknowledge my part in the thing. That's ownership. I did say it. I did express it. I made a mistake. Then there's empathy. This is the willingness to listen to the other person about how it impacted them when you did it, without defending yourself or offering your side of things immediately. That's the temptation, but being able to say, I see this has impacted you. Are you open to sharing with me how? And then being able to say, I hear you. I understand that that impacted you. Accountability is, what are you going to do about it? And this is the step at which, if you take accountability, you actually earn trust. So if you're able to get to step 4, you will have a stronger relationship than you did before the trust breach. And accountability is going to look like, I won't do it again, or this is how I'm going to educate myself, or this is how I'm going to practice this skill. And then finally, assurance is, you must follow up. So if you said, I'm going to be accountable, and then you do all of that work, but you don't tell the other person, how will they know it happened? That's how you close the loop. That's how you end the cycle. It's how you make sure that the conflict finally ends, that repair has fully taken place. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Karen to talk a little bit more about a model that can help you understand why someone might have the reaction they do to a trust breach or to a mistake with language.
Yes, and so that model is a SCARF model, and David Rock, who is an expert in neuroscience, created this. And he basically created these 5 domains of the human experience that can either move us toward reward or away from that, basically, which is moving towards threat. And so the first one is status, and that's just basically your personal worth. Certainty is a sense of what the future holds. Autonomy is a sense of control how much control you have over the situation. Relatedness is a sense of safety with others. And fairness is a sense of what is partial and just. So these areas can look very different for folks, but if one of them is triggered, touched, or affected by, let's say, using non-inclusive language or a trust breach, what happens is it will send your body into something we call amygdala hijack, which is the emotional part of your brain. And so, Alida, if we go to the next slide, I think we have some things. And so basically we call this is when you're triggered, and this is when you're in a heightened emotional state. And we know that it takes about 18 minutes once this happens for those hormones to leave your body. So it's quite serious when it happens. And your body is basically saying, I am not safe. Whether that's because I feel threatened by words or physically not safe, and it goes into this state. It's different for everyone. For me, my hands start to shake. I feel butterflies in my stomach and my face feels really warm. I know that I have been triggered in some sense. And so it's important to understand this, Alida, if we go to the next slide, because if you have been triggered or offended or feel disrespected, right? You're often in this state, and it's important for us to remember to stay above the line. We go above the line and below the line all the time. Neither one is bad, but it's helpful to know where we are, especially when we're going to be in communication with folks. That's the key. So if I have been, if I feel unsafe or uncomfortable because someone has misidentified me, in order for me to be in conversation with them and to do some of those steps that Alida pointed out, I want to make sure I'm above the line, which means I'm coming from a place of curiosity, openness, and I'm committed to learn. Like my purpose of saying this is like, yes, I'm hurt, but I trust that we can move on from this point together. If I am below the line, that is going to become a very hard conversation. And I might want to take a break or a pause and regroup and come back, or just realize that maybe that relationship will not be built back up. And so this can also happen the other way. Sorry, Alida, I'll say this really quickly, because sometimes when someone, if I have misgendered someone, that can also put me into amygdala hijack, because my one of my domains has been threatened, right? Now I feel like I have caused harm, I've done something wrong. So I'm also now looking at myself and saying, okay, I'm below the line right now. Let me ask for a minute so I don't cause more harm. And where I really want to be operating from is above the line, which is a point of like learning. So I can quickly say, I'm sorry, correct myself and move on. So it's helpful to know for both sides, because you can be on either side.
And I think that's such an important point, because if we're thinking about our community members and trying to get inclusive language to be central to everything that we do within the village, we have to understand why they're showing up the way that they are. And so if they're being told that the way they've been doing things for a long time is the wrong way and it hurts people, creates harm, that puts them in a place of fear and defensiveness, and they're committed to justifying what they've done in the past. And that's a natural feeling, right? You want to preserve your sense of self. A lot of this comes down to when people have a negative reaction to being corrected, they feel that their sense of being a good person is being challenged. And the reality is that's not what's happening. Good people make mistakes every single day. That's part of being human. It's worth knowing, as an advocate and a champion yourself, that's where they're coming from, so that you can create the space to reassure them that that judgment is not being passed, but instead we're looking for a positive action to be reproduced in the future.
All right, so what was your biggest takeaway from today's session? Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. I'll give you a minute to think about that and throw it in the chat or put it in the chat when you're ready. Thank you, Pete. Yeah, Debbie, belonging takes work. Very intentional work. Mira, I also want to point out something that you put in here a little bit ago, and it said this is great information for just interacting in life, not just from a DEI context. And that is true, right? I mean, we all strive to belong. And in America, in this context, we have to have it from a DEI lens, but it's human nature. And I also think when working with communities, at least my experience in my community, that's a helpful lens to view it from, right? Like, especially when you're hearing resistance, like, we all want to belong. We all want what's best for our children. This is how we do it. Like, this is a skill that we need to work on in order to communicate and be in relationship. And this is what's necessary to do it, right? And so that's been helpful to frame it here where I live.
In terms of next steps, just so that you feel like you can keep this learning going, we have a few resources for you that can be useful. So there are tools like Textio that can help you correct language. If you're familiar with tools like Grammarly that help you make sure that what you're writing is grammatically correct, Textio makes sure that what you're writing is inclusive. There are additional language resources linked here. There's also a great talk from Kimberly Crenshaw on intersectionality. So what to do about the fact that we hold many identities at one time, and how can we be inclusive of that? There's an implicit bias test that you can take if you like. I often will say to folks that the most important factor in changing your score, if you don't like the score that you get, is exposure. So the more that you're around people who are not like you, the more your bias decreases. That's the reality of the situation. We have over 100 years of psychological research to show that. So these are some resources that you can use. With that, though, if there are specific questions that come up for you, one will hang out here if you have them, but otherwise we've listed our email addresses on this slide because we're always happy to engage in the conversation outside of the session too. So like I said, with that, we wanted to make sure we left a minute or two at the end in case there were any final questions or reflections. And if we need more time, I know that Karen, Ivana, and I will stay on a few minutes afterwards too. On behalf of the whole Ethos team, though, thank you so much for your involved engagement in today's session.
May I ask a question? And the first question before my question is, are we still recording?
Yes, but I'm going to pause it right now.
Okay. I didn't know if you wanted to click that off or keep it on.